Great. Hi, everyone. So there's been a lot of debate motions set at recent tournaments, in particular at Worlds, at ABP, and at US UDCs, as well as a number of other regional tournaments about private equity. And in general, I think a lot of debaters struggle with finance motions and elements of private equity and just in general investment classes and the differences between different investment classes can be useful for a number of different finance motions. So I thought it would be a good idea to cover it in a lecture today. So we're going to go over a few things, but before then, a disclaimer, which is that I'm going to include a list of my sources at the end, but the slideshow is not perfectly slided. This lecture is meant to help explain the incentive and capacity of private equity firms in a debate context. This is not intended to be an academic text whatsoever. Okay. So we're going to talk about what is private equity, what is not private equity, why is private equity good, and why is private equity bad. Pretty straightforward. So let's begin with what is private equity. Private, in this instance, means any investment class that is not available to the general public. When we talk about equity, we're talking about the ownership stake in something, which is reduced by the number of liabilities it has. So when we refer to shareholder equity, we mean the assets of a company minus the liabilities of that company. When we refer to home equity, we're usually referring to, the value of that home minus any mortgage or outstanding liabilities. So that's what, in general, what the term private equity means. But when most debaters talk about private equity, they're talking about private equity firms. So these are investment firms which pool money into acquiring private equity in order to generate returns. And these PE firms typically take a controlling interest in a company and work with management in order to increase the value of that firm. So this can either be done by purchasing a stake of a private company, or they can also purchase a stake in public companies and take them private, so i.e. off the stock market. And notable examples of this include Dell and Hilton. The deal horizon for private equity is usually between 5 to 10 years, really 5 to 7 years in most instances. So that's kind of the time horizon that we're thinking about when we're thinking about a private equity investment. So private equity is a really, really big industry. The assets under management of US PE firms alone exceeded $3 trillion as of September 2024, and PE markets are growing much faster than public equity markets for the most part. As well, what we see, though, is that the value of assets under management for PE is still lower than public equity. So that means the companies that are on public stock exchanges like Apple or Microsoft are still much larger than PE. Nevertheless, this means that the number of PE assets owned has increased significantly, especially in the last 5 years, which is probably why we've seen it discussed more in debate as it becomes a more important part of the financial world. So significant PE firms that you might hear mentioned include Blackstone, KKR, and EQT. PE firms are alleged to control up to as much as 15 to 20% of the US economy. And the top 10 PE firms, of which Blackstone is generally regarded as the largest, account for a substantial number of the capital that is raised in the industry, but also, again, of the assets under management of these firms. So the implication of this is that the PE industry is not only very large and getting larger, but it's also quite concentrated. So a lot of these assets are held in the hands of not so big a number of firms. Lastly, in order to kind of conceptualize why PE is so important, you have to understand that private equity is everywhere, from shampoo to nursing homes to media companies, data center, even infrastructure like roads and bridges, and utilities like energy and water plants, hospitals, restaurants, literally any industry you can think of, private equity is invested in and does have stake in, which is why it has such a big implication on the economy and the services that day-to-day people interact with. Okay, so some terminology to explain before we get into, the rest of the presentation is what is a leveraged buyout. So you might hear this term tossed around a lot, particularly when we're talking of the harms of private equity. So a leveraged buyout occurs when you acquire a company using primarily borrowed money to cover that cost. So you purchase another firm, and most of the money you use to buy that firm is borrowed. And in a lot of instances, the assets of the company that are being acquired are used as collateral for that loan. So you basically say, hey, give me $20 million to buy this company, and if I don't pay back this loan, you can take the assets of this company, or you can take the company, as your collateral if the loan fails. And so leveraged buyouts declined in popularity after 2008, but they're now on the rise again as a kind of more significant funding source. Ideally, leverage buyouts are used when a firm has high return potential and will lead to higher exit value in the future. So if a private equity firm ideally has an acquisition target that they believe is going to have rapid, say like 10 to 15% growth in the next few years, they're able to use a leverage buyout to spend less money in order to acquire a larger firm than they otherwise would have been able to. And again, ideally, that firm will grow fast enough to be able to pay off that debt. However, this is not always the case. This is just the theoretical use example of which leverage buyouts are based off of. Another thing to consider, and this was a motion about this that was set at the Yale IV a few years ago, is dry powder. So what is dry powder? Dry powder is spent or uncommitted capital, cash that is held by private equity firms. And so the private equity industry has over $1 trillion USD currently in dry capital, which implies really that they are struggling to find attractive acquisition targets, because when you are sitting on this amount of money, obviously that money is not necessarily as productive as it could be if it was actually invested in something that was growing. And so the fact that these companies are holding so much money seems to be due to a number of economic conditions, which we'll touch on later in the slideshow. But in general, the state of the industry right now is that the number of attractive targets that can actually generate the growth that private equity is looking for is falling, and the number of private equity firms competing for this decreasing pool of attractive targets is also growing, which is making the industry more competitive. And so the sum of all of this is that more money has actually been put into private equity than pulled out, i.e. in the form of exits, disbursements in the last 5 years, which means investors are getting a little antsy. They want a return on their money. They want to be taking money out. They want to be taking returns out of their investment, and that hasn't necessarily been happening at the pace that private equity has wanted. Okay. So who invests in private equity? Where do they actually get all this money? Because as we flagged at the beginning, private implies that these firms, not just anyone in the general public can buy them. And so the minimum investment in most private equity firms is very high. It's typically millions of dollars, and the minimum holding period can be 10 plus years for their money, which means the investors are not even going to be able to touch these millions of dollars for years and years. And so there's two types of investors that normally invest in private equity. Institutional investors, which is any investment vehicle that invests on behalf of other people. So think pension funds, banks, endowments, hedge funds, sovereign wealth funds, that kind of thing. In fact, pension funds are a very significant investor in private equity. The top 20 global pension funds with the largest dollar allocation to PE had over $700 billion invested in private equity in 2024. And the Canadian pension plan has over 20% of their entire plan invested in private equity. On the other hand, accredited investors are the type of person that would also be able to invest in private equity. So these are individuals or entities, such as businesses, that meet specific financial criteria to gain access to higher risk investments, which private equity is considered to be higher risk. And so the criteria to become an accredited investor will usually have an income, a yearly income benchmark, a minimum net worth, and other requirements for you to legally purchase private equity. And so, why do people buy private equity? What is the advantage of private equity? The idea is, again, as is fundamental in all finance, there is a higher risk associated with private equity since it's not, an established asset class. You're going after private companies that are not currently in the investment pool. But as the saying goes, there is then higher return potential, and there have been periods of time where private equity has had much higher returns than the public market. And so why am I, explaining who invests in private equity? Why is this relevant to debate? So I've judged a few private equity debates where debaters will make arguments about the average person losing money in private equity. And this is kind of true and also kind of not true. In terms of an individual basis, it's highly unlikely that the average person is actually invested in a private equity firm because of the requirements that we discuss here. So it's not like, average Joe Schmo is putting $50,000 of his life savings into a private equity firm, and if it doesn't succeed, then he's losing all of his money. Like, that's not a realistic impact in a debate about private equity. But as we've discussed, major public actors like pension funds, which of course, manage the retirement savings of hundreds of millions of people, are invested in public equity. So to some degree, the public and average people are also invested in the performance and return of private equity firms, which is, again, part of why private equity matters and why we debate about it. Okay, next, how does private equity make money? So there are 3 different ways that private equity makes money, some of which are tied to, the criticisms that private equity has faced in recent years. The first is management fees, which are charged to investors, and investors are limited partners. So we're not going to go into, how private equity firms are structured, but just know that limited partners in private equity firms are investors, and they're charged a fee for the firm to manage their money. And the income from management fees is just taxed as regular income. On the other hand, a primary way that private equity firms make money is called carried interest. So carried interest is basically where they charge a percentage of profit on the assets they own. So typically, something like 20% of profit for private equity firms that they make, they're able to keep for themselves after they hit the hurdle rate. So the hurdle rate is a pre-established minimum rate of return to the limited partners, say like 7-8%, that is decided upon prior to the limited partners, giving the private equity firm their money. And once that rate of return is met, a percentage of the profit after that point is capped by the private equity firm themselves. And so one point of contention with this model is that this carried interest is usually charged or taxed as capital gains. And capital gains usually incur lower taxes and is a more flexible taxation system than income in most countries and under most taxation systems. And so some people say that private equity is not doing their part in terms of, paying taxes, and these firms are, keeping too large of a gain from their business. The last thing is dividend recapitalization. So again, this is a very contentious form of income for private equity. When a private equity firm does a dividend recapitalization, they take out a loan against their own portfolio company to pay a special dividend to investors. So again, somewhat similar to what we were talking about when it comes to leveraged buyouts, the private equity firm will take out a loan to distribute back to their investors at the expense with the collateral of their portfolio companies. And this can be ruled fraudulent if it leaves the company insolvent or with unreasonably low capital. But for the most instance, a lot of private equity firms are still able to get away with this without that regulatory scrutiny. And so as per the New York Times, in the second half of 2020 alone, private equity borrowed $27 billion in order to pay for dividends and debt restructurings that would flow directly back to their investors and themselves. And so again, and we're going to talk about debt a lot more later on in this presentation. This is very controversial because it just seems like you're saddling the portfolio company with more debt to benefit the investors without necessarily actually benefiting the company itself. Okay, so how do private equity firms exit a deal? How do they actually make money? The most common is a sale to a buyer. So this can be a strategic buyer. So it can be another business that has a complementary or similar area. So for example, selling a inventory software company to a major firm that has a lot of inventory to management, or a financial or secondary buyer. So that would be another PE firm, usually one that has a different value focus. So for example, a PE firm that specializes in distressed assets might sell their company to a different PE firm that focuses more on expansion or growth once the company is no longer a distressed asset. As well as some other things, ways that PE firms make money are by IPOing, so relisting the company on a public stock exchange. This is less common because IPOs are riskier and they tend to be very expensive, but this is something that happens, that a company will be taken private and then relisted a few years later. Sometimes PE firms will do management buyouts, so they'll sell the company's stake back to management. But those are the primary ways that PE firms will exit a deal. Now, do PE firms always have good exits? The answer to this is a resounding no. And for a number of reasons, currently, it's been very difficult for PE firms to make good exits. There's a lot of economic uncertainty right now with tariffs and the political situation. A lot of the assets that were purchased by private equity firms in the kind of PE boom from 2020 to 2021 were purchased at a high price because of the increased competition that we discussed earlier. And so it's harder for them to find a potential buyer because they are selling at, higher prices. And interest rates are also very high right now. So it's more difficult for a company to take out a loan to buy an asset or, engage in an exit deal with a PE firm. So those are all reasons why it's been hard for private equity to kind of, exit or part ways with their initial assets. And so, because of the after effects of this PE boom, what we have seen is from 2022 to the present, we've seen lower fundraising for PE firms and lower distributions from PE firms back to their investors because of the fact that finding a good exit has been difficult. So that's kind of the macroeconomic environment. And so again, I want to flag that I think in a lot of debates, a lot of debaters are operating on the pretext that all PE companies are super, super successful and they're all these like financial behemoths that don't have any risks and they're all making oodles and boodles of cash. But that isn't necessarily the case. Again, right now, especially with the macroeconomic conditions, a lot of PE firms are struggling. Okay. Before we kind of get into the arguments for and against private equity, I want to discuss what is not private equity. And I think that this is very important because, again, I think debaters get confused with the arguments for and against venture capital or for and against other investment classes that they might have heard of in the past. Like we've already discussed how PE does not pose the same risk to retail investors as like public equity, for example. And so I just want to be clear about the differences between private equity and venture capital and hedge funds, which are the two big things that I see debaters confuse PE for. So private equity is considered an alternative asset class. So, VC and hedge funds are also considered alternative asset classes. They all raise money from accredited or institutional investors, as we talked about previously, and they all use that limited partnership structure where their investors are part of their firm in that way. And so in a sense, venture capital is technically private equity. So there is some overlap. So I'm not saying it's more of a Venn diagram. It's not like, two separate circles. But the key difference is that venture capital usually focuses on startup companies that are in the very infant stages of getting going. And venture capital is usually focused on much smaller deals and smaller amounts of cash. Whereas private equity usually focuses on more mature companies, larger deals, more established industries. And so again, these are different financial specializations. And so you can't necessarily control C, control V, the arguments you would make about venture capital to private equity. On the other hand, hedge funds focus on private equity differently, primarily in terms of time scale. So hedge funds focus on making a short-term profit through highly liquid investments, so things like stocks, bonds, currencies, derivatives, while private equity focuses, as we talked about, on more long-term, less liquid investments. So the amount of time and flexibility that investors have with their money in private equity is going to be, they're going to have a lot less flexibility than they would when they put their money in a hedge fund. So again, these are all alternative asset classes, an alternative to like the stock exchange. However, they're not all the same, and you can't just use any argument that you've heard about one or the other against all three, because of the fact that they do focus on different kinds of companies and they have completely different goals as firms. Okay. So why is private equity generally considered to be a good thing? So a few things. The first is that private equity is considered to be able to exploit unknown opportunities more effectively than public markets. So as I mentioned, IPOs are very expensive, they're very difficult, and many firms are never going to make an initial public offering and are never going to be publicly traded. And so that means that all of these private firms are kind of essentially invisible to the investment market. It's not possible for investors to kind of get a slice of the pie without, kind of that extensive insider knowledge. And so private equity's claim is that they will kind of go into this previously untapped market and they will find all the opportunities for growth and help the companies that would never have been able to be helped. So it's just kind of saying that they will, inject capital and find opportunities for growth in markets that public markets cannot reach. The other thing, and the primary reason that private equity would be considered to be a good thing, is value-adding ownership. So unlike other investment firms that are passive and will just hold an asset class, private equity is very involved in the ownership of a company. So they will take active management steps in order to create value for the firm. And so that can look like implementing software that improves the operation of a firm. That can look like changing strategy in terms of marketing budgets or giving them additional funding for marketing budgets to target new markets. In general, private equity will focus on those things like middle management, hiring, expense management, operations management, while the employees of the firm who are specialized in, tech or healthcare or whatever industry it is can just focus on their jobs. So that's kind of the idea, is that private equity is just kind of the total business management suite that is going to help your firm reduce all their inefficiencies and make more money over time. The final thing to note here is in terms of incentives. So why does a private equity firm care so much and is better than comparative funding sources in investing in a firm? And here we come upon the principal agent issue, which is a very common problem that is discussed in finance. So the principal agent issue is really saying that, the principal is giving the agent money and, is expecting the agent to act in their best interest. But that doesn't always happen because the agent has their own incentives and the agent also wants to make money. And the agent being typically, investment firms, hedge funds, things like that. And so in private equity firms, the agent earns money based off of the performance of the asset and not just collecting a fee, as we discussed. So private equity doesn't just take a management fee as many other investment firms do. They also care and are personally invested in the growth of that business. So the idea goes that in terms of incentives, they have better incentives than other investment firms or other funding sources because of the way that their profit structure works. And so all of this means that theoretically, private equity is hyper-specialized in increasing the returns of businesses, helping to make them more valuable and more efficient. So let's look at kind of pro-private equity arguments in the context of a motion like this House regrets the rise of private equity. And so, the reason why usually you would use to defend private equity is the comparative. So many private equity firms are going to invest in distressed companies or companies that are facing some kind of difficulty, who have some growth potential in the first place. And so the saying goes, if private equity did not invest in these firms, it's not clear that they would otherwise succeed or that they would otherwise be able to get other sources of funding to help them with their, logistical issues. And that's because struggling companies or companies that are not super successful cannot necessarily raise funds by taking on further debt, because they're probably going to incur very high interest rates. There's probably not going to be a ton of creditors who want to give them money in the first place if they're not doing super well. And so they're kind of, stuck between, a wall and a hard place. So the idea is that private equity lends them a hand, helps them out with their potential, and in return gets a cut of that profit in the future. And so when we look at it retroactively, even though bad things might have happened as a result of private equity, which we will talk about, of course, later on, you really want to try to weigh the comparative in defending private equity and say, if private equity had not come into this market, would this market have faced financial difficulties? What would those financial difficulties have been? And why would they not have been able to overcome them otherwise? And so as well, private equity, like we mentioned, can drive investment through the desire to diversify from traditional assets. So private equity is often used in terms of an investment vehicle as kind of like a counter investment to the public market. So as a very rich institutional investor, you don't just want to invest in public assets because, the public stock market is very volatile, things can happen at any moment. And so the idea is because private equity existed, more money was introduced into kind of the investment space as a whole, because investors wanted to diversify away and were willing to give their money to private equity. So in terms of, again, a retrospective angle, the idea is that without private equity, this money wouldn't necessarily have been introduced into the market at all, or maybe would have been introduced not into companies that help people and sell things, but things like bonds or derivatives or other things that maybe don't have as much of a day-to-day impact on the economy. And so that is one thing to consider in terms of the retrospective angle. So finally, in terms of some big case studies for companies that are can be mentioned that are PE success stories. Firstly, we have Yahoo and Dell. So both of these companies sold parts of their firms that were underperforming and refocused on other core strengths due to the acquisition of private equity. And so Yahoo sold their streaming services, tech reporting platforms. Yahoo Japan was sold off, and they focused more on Yahoo Finance and Yahoo Sports, which have become much more profitable in recent years for the firm. In terms of Dell, they turned drastically away from PC sales, which were part of the reason they were really struggling when PC sales were slowing down, and they kind of refocused their company model on data storage and management, cloud networking, cybersecurity, those aspects of the business. So those are two of the kind of ideal case of private equity, where you have an industry that is struggling due to shifts in technology or market conditions that are leaving them behind. They're not innovating. Their current management and shareholders don't have necessarily the vision or the expertise to take them to that next level. So private equity is able to come in, refocus the business and increase profits and make sure that business is able to stay productive and not go bankrupt, and preserve those jobs and preserve that economic contribution. Okay, let's talk then about why private equity is criticized most often in debates. And so the saying goes that private equity is still trying to generate returns on a relatively short timeline. So 5 to 10 years is not, a blink of an eye, but it's not eternity either. And so in that period of time, cutting expenses is going to have the same effect as any changes that you implement that are going to generate more revenue. Like in terms of the bottom line, the benefit is still just going to be to make the bottom line look better, to, make the company look more profitable. And so part of making a firm more efficient, usually when private equity comes into play, is going to be laying people off, selling off assets, and reducing costs, sometimes in key areas that might really hurt the quality of services the business is able to provide. And so where the most criticism of private equity comes in is in industries that really serve key societal roles, particularly ones that have relatively low competition or where it's relatively difficult for people to change providers. And so they don't really have a choice if private equity messes up the quality of that business. So in particular, local journalism companies, water utility companies, healthcare companies, and kind of nursing home or care provider companies have come under heavy criticism in the last few years as private equity has acquired these businesses and raised costs while selling off key parts of the business and reducing service. And so again, when that service is like the PC industry or Dell or Yahoo, there's a lot of alternatives. There's a lot of other things that customers can do. And so the impact isn't that big. But when it comes to these essential industries, that's when people start having problems. And so even for standard retail companies, so you might have heard names like Red Lobster or Toys R Us being cited as kind of victims of private equity, some believe that private equity kind of takes firms that have consistent growth that might be struggling in some areas and don't have the highest growth, but private equity takes them and kind of strips them for parts, which we'll talk about a little bit in the next slide. And so a statistic that you might hear a lot in debates is that companies purchased by private equity are 10 times more likely to go bankrupt. And part of that is because of the cost cutting and the risks that private equity firms are going to take once they acquire a business. So let's go back to kind of that retrospective perspective. So regretting private equity, what has private equity done in the last few years? So some of the big instances that we hear about are healthcare in particular. So healthcare is a $1 trillion industry in the United States. And it has been found through research that hospitals that have been overtaken by private equity, patients are more likely to fall, they're more likely to get new infections, and they're more likely to experience other harms or worse experiences during their stay after being acquired by a private equity firm. A lot of staffing at ERs is also done by private equity run firms. And again, similarly, negative consequences have been found in those fields as well. We also see private equity using bankruptcy very frequently as a tool to exploit profits from companies. And so we see this particularly in the case of pension liabilities. So Friendly's, which is a ice cream chain in the United States, was pushed into bankruptcy by private equity firms that forced them to sell their properties and lease them back. And the reason that private equity firms do this is because it's a short-term cash inflow. So if you sell all of the properties that your company owns, then it's going to make your balance sheet look good because you just received all this cash from that sale. But in the long term, you're creating a much higher operating expense, which is all these leases that you have to pay every single year. So you're essentially saddling the firm with long-term expenses. And so once Friendly's took on this kind of like expense burden, they weren't able to kind of survive. They had to go through the bankruptcy process. And during the bankruptcy process, the pension liabilities of the firm were discharged because it was proven that they were no longer able to pay them. And so after that, upon exiting the bankruptcy process, Friendly's was reacquired by an affiliated private equity firm of the initial firm that purchased them in the first place. And so essentially what this private equity firm did was buy a company, bankrupt that company, discharge the pension liabilities, which is hundreds of millions of dollars, and robbing all the employees of their pension, and then repurchase that firm after. And so that's kind of, like the shady debt policies that people criticize when it comes to private equity. And in general, firms are often saddled with large amounts of debt that they must clear. And we see this when it comes to those leveraged buyouts, which we discussed at the beginning, which is, the private equity firm has borrowed a ton of money against your assets in order to purchase you, and you have to pay off that debt, or it's your assets that are on the line that are being used as collateral. So again, in those instances, while it reduces risk for the private equity firm, because for the private equity firm, all they lose if they don't pay back the loan is, the company they wanted to acquire in the first place. But for that firm, it can be incredibly difficult for them to repay that debt burden and repay that interest. And so what that means is they usually, again, have to do even more aggressive cost cutting, but also have to increase prices for their customers to try to pay that money back. And so after KKR acquired a significant part of the New Jersey water utility system, bills increased by 28% for people. And again, like we discussed, it's not like you can just change water utility companies that easily. There's not a lot of competition in that field in most areas. And we see this not just in New Jersey, but also in the United Kingdom and in other countries where private equity has been involved in water distribution. And so in terms of why we oppose the rise of private equity, the idea is that in retrospect, maybe these firms would have found other funding sources, or maybe they would have been totally fine and they weren't even struggling in the first place before private equity acquired them. They just weren't, these amazing growth stocks because they were, just a local ice cream chain. And so people often say retrospectively, these companies would have been much better off if private equity had never gotten involved in their business. A few other things to talk about in terms of why private equity is commonly criticized. Private equity also differs from public companies in one key aspect, which is transparency. So there are strict regulatory requirements that public companies have to meet in order to be listed on a stock exchange. They have to disclose their ownership, how they are complying with regulations, their revenue streams, how profitable they are, how much debt they've taken on, their legal liabilities, and a huge other range of information. And so really this came into law after the Great Depression. The Securities Exchange Act and the Securities Act in the United States created these laws because part of what fueled the Great Depression is that companies were just, reporting nonsense on their financials to their investors. And so this means that when private equity really starts to aggressively take over and consolidate themselves in a certain industry, there's a lot less regulatory attention to wrongdoing in that industry because regulatory bodies don't have information. They don't have information about, all the people who are suing a firm. They don't have information about, foreign owners that a firm might have, or, what firms are doing in order to comply with regulations, if they're doing anything at all. It's kind of a, as debaters love to say, a black box of information once your company is acquired by private equity. And so one of the most influential case studies that people use as an illustration of why this is bad is that in the United States, private equity massively increased their investment in nursing homes. It grew from $5 billion to over $100 billion since 2000. And a landmark 2021 study concluded that private equity ownership was correlated with approximately 22,000 premature deaths from 2005 to 2017. So this is pre-pandemic and all of the, terrible things that happened in nursing homes during the pandemic. It was already found that the way that these private equity firms were making money from these nursing homes was to cut staffing, cut costs at all expenses, which was leading to more falls, more injuries, and, as we say, more premature deaths. And so again, part of how this is connected to regulation is that once all these studies started coming out, lawmakers and regulators obviously, started acting to try to prevent harms in the nursing home industry. But obviously, A, regulation takes a very long time, and B, there's also a lot of lobbying done by private equity and kind of revolving door of regulators from the government to private equity firms that mean that regulation is generally difficult. But because it's not transparent, because you can't get, quarter by quarter information for all these firms, regulation is always going to be on a lag with private equity because you don't know what private equity is doing. You don't know what harms they're causing until it becomes really, really, really big and obvious, which obviously means that industries are much less closely monitored. A lot of negative things can happen, again, especially in crucial industries like nursing care. And so finally, like we discussed, leveraged buyouts are a very dangerous kind of debt in times of economic downturn or high interest rates like we see today. And this is something that was actually key in contributing to the 1989 stock market crash. And because of the lack of transparency, it's not actually clear how much is loaned out to private equity firms and how bad their financial situation really is. Now, some private equity firms are actually public. So Blackstone, like we mentioned, which is considered to be the largest private equity firm, is public. So they do have to publish some things about their internal finances. But a lot of the financials of private equity firms is still not clear to the public. And so the primary private equity boom really took place in prime economic conditions in 2021. Really high investor interest, low interest rates after COVID, money free flowing in the economy, and those conditions have not necessarily held. So, the debt situation of these private equity firms could become much, much worse in the next few years, especially if the economy does not improve. And it has been estimated that the amount of cash on hand that private equity firms have to cover their day-to-day operations and expenses is near the lowest it's been since, the 2008 recession, when obviously macroeconomic conditions were very bad. And so the implication of this is not just that, lack of regulatory oversight leads to practical harms for customers, but also for these firms, which, as we've established, own trillions of dollars in assets. If they start defaulting, if they start going bankrupt or going under, that could have a massive ripple effect on the economy. We just don't really know how likely that is, or when's going to happen, or how big that's going to be because of that lack of oversight. The final thing that I want to discuss here is really just, what is the complicated part about private equity debates? Because there's an essential incentive clash between proposition and opposition, which is that proposition says PE firms want to exit. They're not trying to hold these assets forever. And so they can't just destroy a company's value completely because they still need to make some kind of return. So they do have a strong positive incentive to make these firms better. And then, of course, the opposition response is yes, but private equity firms only care about generating 5 to 10-year returns, and they can just destroy company value as long as they make a return in those 5 to 10 years and, skip off into the sunset. Obviously, I'm simplifying the arguments for both sides, but that's generally the incentive clash that I think debaters find hard to overcome from the other side, because these are pretty, strong, straightforward incentives for either side. And so obviously, as we have pointed out in our different illustrations, both are possible. So there are situations where responsible fiscal management leads to some great exit deals for private equity firms that benefit the investors, that benefit the firm, and that also mean that the company is stronger, makes more revenues, is like just better overall. And there are also a lot of situations where you kind of get that stripping for parts, where the private equity firm, sells all your properties, sells all your assets, cuts all your costs, and cuts all your different divisions of your businesses in order to, turn a quick buck. So both of these situations are possible. And so really, there's, two things you want to do. The first is you want to win the illustration battle as much as possible. So you want to use the examples we talked about today. It's also a good idea to read up on some more, other use cases of private equity. There are a lot on the internet. And so you want to try to win the framing battle. So you want to try to make it, seem like on net you have more examples of private equity doing a good job and industries where private equity has benefited. And so on proposition, what you really want to hammer home is the logic behind private equity. And I think you can kind of use the economic condition or situation that we're in right now to talk about why private equity firms actually don't just want to screw every single company over, which is that if you screw every single company over, sure, maybe you've sold it off for each of their little parts, but you're not really going to get a great exit deal. You're not going to sell that company to someone else in the future who's going to pay you a lot of money for it. And that is not necessarily in your best interest. And so I think on the incentive battle, proposition really does win. And again, like I said, it's very important to emphasize the comparative. So it is absolutely not true that private equity only invests in firms that would otherwise have been totally fine and dandy. There are a lot of threats to almost any business industry. Even if you're just an ice cream chain, even if you're just a grocery store chain, you do face a lot of threats from local monopolies. You face a lot of threat from supply chain issues. If you aren't able to have an efficient supply chain and have someone assist you with your supply chain, there's no guarantee you would survive anyway. And so I think really weighing on the comparative and explaining why it's likely that in the absence of private equity, a firm that was already struggling would continue to have a number of issues pile on is going to be one of the benefits of private equity, because as we have discussed, OP does have a lot of unsavory negative examples to choose from. You need to make sure you're winning the comparative battle. And in terms of opposition, like we talked about, there's a lot that you can weigh in terms of the lack of oversight and the debt. So in terms of the lack of oversight, the big problem is that even if there are some wins, we don't know when the wins are coming or when the losses are coming. And so because of the fact that it could be good, it could be bad, but we're not going to know about it until 5-10 years. And the big ramifications, private equity already owns a huge part of the industry. You don't see the bad results or the good results until then. On weighing in terms of likelihood, the risk is maybe not one that you want to take in a debate. So I think weighing on the lack of oversight is very important, and as well on the debt context, which is just that none of the things these private equity firms are saying they're going to do is going to happen if they go super bankrupt, because they've taken on tons and tons of debt. Their entire business model is centered around debt. Interest rates are very high. The economy is doing very poorly. If this all blows up in their face, no one is going to get any of the promised benefits. And so I think beyond just the illustrations of some businesses do well and some businesses do badly when taken over by private equity, those are the most important overarching aspects that you want to emphasize for both proposition and opposition in any private equity debate. So that brings us to the end of the slideshow. In conclusion, private equity may or may not hurt you. It's not necessarily always clear, but either way, it does exist, and we're going to have to keep debating about it. So thank you for listening. and that's private equity in the context of debating.